Okay, so you've been poking around thinking about hosting a static website on AWS, and I bet you're looking for that like super condensed version, right? The need to know, no fluff breakdown. Well, think of this deep dive as your express lane to understanding just that.
We're going to cut right through the jargon and really zero in on what matters most.
Exactly. We've sifted through the AWS documentation on hosting a static website, specifically using AWS Amplify, all to give you the key insights, without drowning you in all the technical details.
Right.
So our mission here is pretty simple. We want to nail down the real benefits of this whole approach, walk you through the core steps, and understand why this method is so appealing for folks who want to be in the know, but without the overwhelm.
Yeah.
Sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay, let's dive right in. First things first, what exactly is a static website? And maybe more importantly, why should you, the listener, even care?
So a static website, in the simplest terms, is basically delivering pre-built files. So things like your HTML pages, images, videos, and any JavaScript that adds interactivity. All that goes straight to the person visiting your site.
Okay.
Now, the big draw here, and probably what caught your attention, is the cost. It's super low. We're talking typically outside the AWS free tier, somewhere between $1 to $3 a month. And get this, it could even be as low as like 50 cents a month if you're within the free tier.
50 cents. I mean, come on, that's practically free. So for someone who just needs a simple online presence, maybe a personal portfolio or basic informational website, this makes hosting insanely affordable.
Right.
It really opens up possibilities for anyone to have a website. What else is compelling about going the static route on AWS?
Well, besides the minimal cost, you also get incredible reliability. See, with static websites, you're not dealing with dynamic elements or server-side calculations every time someone visits. That means there are just fewer things that can go wrong. And the amount of IT administration you need to worry about, it's almost non-existent. AWS really does all the heavy lifting behind the scenes.
So I could basically just focus on my content, right? Creating it, updating it, without constantly fiddling with server settings.
Exactly. And don't think that simplicity equals sacrificing performance. AWS Amplify uses Amazon CloudFront, their global content delivery network, or CDN, and also Amazon S3 for storage. Essentially, your website's files are kept safe and sound on this really durable and scalable storage service, and then distributed through this huge worldwide network of servers.
Wow.
So basically, you get this built-in, powerful infrastructure that can handle anything from just a handful of visitors to a massive surge in traffic. And it all happens automatically. You get that enterprise-level scalability without needing a whole IT department.
That's pretty impressive.
Okay.
So the low cost is definitely a huge plus. The reliability sounds fantastic. The hands-off approach is appealing. But how does AWS Amplify actually make all this magic happen? Behind the scenes, it still seems like there must be some level of complexity involved.
Right, so this is where Amplify really shines. It gives you what's called a Git-based CI/CD workflow.
Okay.
To break that down, every time you change your website's code and save those changes in a linked Git repository, a popular choice is GitHub, Amplify automatically takes that updated code and deploys it to your live website. It's continuous integration and continuous deployment, but made really easy to use. So instead of manually uploading files every time you make a change, you just save your work in Git and Amplify does the rest. It builds your updated website and puts it live for you.
So if I tweak some text on my site, add a new image, whatever, and I save it in Git, it just like magically appears live on the internet. That's pretty amazing. Can you walk us through the basic steps? Even for someone who's not, a coding whiz, how does this all get set up?
Sure. So the AWS documentation lays it out in a pretty straightforward way. Let's say you're starting from scratch. A lot of web developers these days use something like React, which is a super popular tool for building interactive websites. The example they use actually leverages something called Vite, which is a fast way to set up a basic web project. You'd run this command in your computer's terminal, npm, create Vite, at latest static website template React.
Okay.
This basically sets up the foundation for your website in a new folder. From there, you go into that new static website directory and install all the necessary software packages it needs. You can even spin up a local development server on your computer just to preview your basic site before it goes live.
So that gets the initial website files created in my computer.
Yeah.
What's next? How do I get it online with Amplify?
Right. So now we need to start tracking all the changes you make to those website files. This is where Git comes in. Inside that project folder you created, you start by initializing a Git repository. You use the command git init. Then you stage all your files, meaning you're telling Git, hey, I want to include these in my next save point. You do that with git add git. Then you actually create that initial save point, which is called a commit, using git commit act-gem first commit. It's like taking a snapshot of your website's code. After that, you connect this local repository on your computer to a remote one on a platform like GitHub.
Okay.
You first need to create an empty repository on GitHub just through their website. They'll give you a URL for it. Then, back in your computer's terminal, you link your local repository to that remote one with git remote add origin your repo role. Then you finalize the connection by setting the name of your main branch and pushing your code up to GitHub with git branch -m main and then git push you origin main. That uploads your website's code to your GitHub repository.
Got it. So now my website's code is sitting safe and sound up on GitHub. How does AWS Amplify connect to this and actually get the site deployed?
All right, now it's time to head over to the AWS Management Console in your web browser and go to the AWS Amplify console. You choose to create a new app and select GitHub as the source for your code. It'll ask you to authorize AWS to access your GitHub account.
Right.
Once you've done that, you pick the specific repository you just made, which would be that static website one and the main branch.
Okay. And what happens then? Does it need a bunch of complicated settings and configurations within Amplify?
You know what? For a basic static website like this, the documentation actually suggests you can usually stick with the default build settings. Amplify's pretty smart. It can usually look at the files in your repository and figure out how to build and prep everything for deployment.
Yeah.
You just need to give it a quick once-over, review what it's chosen, and then you hit save and deploy.
So it's almost as easy as just pointing Amplify to my GitHub repo and letting it do its thing.
Pretty much. Amplify then grabs your application's code from GitHub, builds it if it needs to, and then deploys all those static files to a global CDN. You'll get a temporary URL, which usually looks something like https://randomstring.amplifyapp.com, where your live website will be accessible on the internet. They say this initial deployment usually takes about 2 to 5 minutes.
Okay.
And here's the really cool part. From that point on, anytime you push new code to that main branch on GitHub, Amplify just automatically picks up those changes and redeploys your website. You don't have to do a thing.
That's awesome. So efficient. What if someone's not using GitHub, though? Are there other options?
Oh, definitely. Amplify is actually quite flexible in that sense. The documentation mentions that you can connect code repositories from other platforms too, like Bitbucket, GitLab, even AWS's own Code Commit.
Oh, okay.
And if you really don't want to use a Git provider at all, there's even an option to manually upload your website's build artifacts straight to Amplify. So there are quite a few ways to go about it, depending on your preferred workflow.
That's great. Lots of options. Security is always a big concern, right?
Yeah.
When you're connecting these kinds of services. How does Amplify make sure it's accessing my code on GitHub securely?
Yeah, that's a really important point. So Amplify uses something called deploy keys to access your repository. Think of a deploy key as like a special secure password just for Amplify to use, so it can get to your code on GitHub without you having to hand over your main GitHub password. And they explicitly state that while Amplify does need to fetch a temporary access token from your repository provider during the initial setup, they don't actually store that long-lived token on their own AWS servers. So that helps keep your code safe.
Okay, that's good to know. So all of this sounds pretty darn straightforward. What are the essential things I need to have set up before I even start trying to deploy a static website with Amplify? What are the prerequisites?
Well, the basics here are pretty much standard for anyone dabbling in a little web development. Obviously, you'll need an active AWS account. You'll also want to have your AWS profile set up on your computer if you plan on doing anything through the terminal. Although, for setting up with Amplify, most of it happens in the web console. But importantly, you'll need Node.js and NPM, that's the Node Package Manager, installed on your machine since the example uses React Invite. And, of course, some basic understanding of how Git works and a GitHub account are needed to manage your code.
So if I've got those foundational pieces in place, setting up a static website with Amplify should be doable.
Yeah.
Even if I'm not, a super experienced developer.
Absolutely. The documentation we looked at is designed to guide you through each step, keep the initial setup as painless as possible.
Okay, great. Once my website is all up and running, are there any, essential maintenance tasks or things I need to be mindful of?
Yes, actually. They highlight one really important step in the documentation. It's called cleanup resources. Basically, if you ever decide you don't need the website anymore, or if you were just experimenting, it's super important to go into the Amplify console and delete the application you created.
Oh, wait.
This is especially crucial if you're not operating within the AWS free tier. You want to avoid any unexpected charges for resources you're no longer using.
Yeah. No surprise bills, please. Good tip. What else does the documentation suggest, as helpful next steps once someone's got their static website up and running this way?
Well, they recommend a couple of key things. One is adding a custom domain name to your website. So instead of having that default amplifyapp.com address, you could use your own domain, like yourwebsite.com. They specifically point to Amazon Route 53, AWS's domain name system service, as the way to manage this.
Makes sense.
The other suggestion is to delve a little deeper into Amplify's broader web application deployment capabilities. It's a hint that hosting static websites is just one piece of what Amplify can do. It's also built to handle more complex web applications.
So this static website hosting is like a gateway, in a way, to the wider world of AWS Amplify.
Exactly. It's a relatively simple way to get your feet wet with AWS for web hosting, but Amplify has a whole bunch of features that can support much more dynamic and feature-rich applications if you need them down the line.
That's cool. And last question, how up-to-date is this information we've been looking at? Cloud technologies, they change so quickly.
The documentation we reviewed was last updated in July 2024, so it's pretty recent.
Okay.
Which is always a good sign when you're dealing with cloud services. The information's likely accurate and current.
That's reassuring.
Oh.
All right, let's bring it all together now. For someone like you or me who wants to understand this stuff without getting totally lost in the AWS universe, what's the bottom line about hosting static websites with Amplify?
The key takeaway is that AWS Amplify offers a really streamlined, cost-effective, super reliable, and effortlessly scalable solution for hosting static websites. And the fact that it automates the deployment process right from your Git repository like GitHub really simplifies things. It
Sure.
makes it accessible even if you're not, a hardcore DevOps expert. You're essentially leveraging the...
I think that's a perfect note to end on. This has been incredibly helpful in demystifying the whole process. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by AWS, this feels like a really approachable solution for certain types of websites. So, for our listeners out there, here's a final thought to chew on. Now that you see just how simple and affordable hosting a static website on AWS with Amplify can be, what kind of online presence could you create or maybe even migrate to this platform? And thinking about that easy Git-based deployment, what other projects in your life could benefit from a similar, streamlined, version-controlled workflow? It really opens up some interesting possibilities for how we manage and deploy our digital creations, doesn't it?
Definitely.
All right, that's a wrap for this deep dive. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Thanks for having me.